Hello, internet viewers of the Doomwake channel. My name is Elesh Norn, and I have hijacked this channel for today's episode of All Will Be One Spoilers. No, I'm just kidding. What's up, everybody? I got some new headphones. Not really sure what these extensions are for. Didn't come with an instruction manual, so they didn't tell me what it's for. I don't know. But we are here with some Phyrexia. All Will Be One. We got the full spoiler. And as is going to be custom moving forward, I actually don't think I did one for Brothers War, but we're going to do it for all the new sets moving forward. I'm going to give you my top 10. Remember, this is going to be mostly Pioneer focused. I do have a couple of modern ones on the list, along with some honorable mentions, because this set appears to be awesome. I, went through the spoiler a couple of times. Had a little bit of difficulty narrowing it down to 10 cards, but like I said, the honorable mentions, there's some stuff in there that I like. I think this set's going to shake up Pioneer a ton. I think there are, a couple of cards that could potentially be on the docket for Modern. But yeah, that's pretty much it. So I won't make you wait any longer. Let's get started with honorable mentions first. All right, now that I've taken off my brand new headset, let's go ahead and get started with our honorable mentions here. So first one on your screen here is Venerated Rod Priest. Now, you might think this is a little bit low because I've seen quite a few people talk about this for Modern, and we'll talk about why. So this is green for a 1/2 with Toxic 1. Toxic is a new ability. It kind of replaces Infect. It's the 2023 version of Infect, and it says whenever players dealt combat damage by this creature also get a poison counter. It has poison counters equal to the number of Toxic, and whenever a creature you control becomes the target of a spell, not spell or ability, target opponent gets a poison counter. So the combo with this is a card called Ground Rift, which is red for a sorcery. It says target creature, I think without flying, can't block this turn, and it has Storm. So the concept is you play a bunch of, like in Modern, you play a bunch of free spells. You can go Mutagenic Growth, Gutshot, Summoner's Pact, which also finds Rod Priest, Manamorphose, all the rituals maybe. There's just plenty of different cards that either generate mana or give you just free spells, so you can just kind of, storm off. My kind of issue with that is there was already a Boros Ground Rift Storm deck that Aspiring Spike had been playing a little bit. This is getting you into a third color, and it's also opening you up to stuff like Solitude, removal spells, Bolt, Unholy Heat, Fatal Push, Prismatic Ending. So I'm not really sure what this offers the Storm deck that you didn't already have access to before. So that's why it didn't quite make my top 10. I wouldn't be surprised, given the new schedule, because I am moving back to full-time. I will be going back to playing Modern, so I wouldn't be surprised if I try a deck with this at some point. But, I'm just not sold on it yet. Maybe I have to play a couple of games with it and see how it plays out. But yeah, that's going to be our first honorable mention. All right, second honorable mention here, Canker Bloom. Again, this is a Pioneer card. I don't think it'll make waves in Modern, but this is 2 mana for a 3/2 Phyrexian Fungus. You can pay a colorless and sacrifice it to destroy an artifact, enchantment, or proliferate. Now, the nice thing about this, it's a couple of nice things. One, it has 3 power as opposed to 2 power. So you see a card like Outland Liberator, which does see play in some decks in Modern and Pioneer. Specifically, I think Modern Yawgmoth plays it. But the nice thing about this is the proliferate. So if, like in Yawgmoth, for example, Yawgmoth, the card itself puts -1/-1 counters on creatures. So if you were playing an Outland Liberator, you might want to replace it with the Canker Bloom so that when you have Yawgmoth and you're kind of quote-unquote small balling where you're putting -1/-1 counters on creatures, you can then use this to proliferate, maybe if you don't have some spare mana for Yawgmoth or if you don't have a card left over in your hand. The nice thing, I think the biggest application for this card is in Pioneers. In almost any deck that wants Liberator, I think you're going to want this card over it. Yes, I understand that Liberator, if you're playing with other day-night cards and, like, let's say you have a Stormseeker in the Gruul Boats deck, you flip your Stormseeker and now your Liberator comes into play as the back half, and in some matchups, the back half of that card can be pretty good. The nice thing about Canker Bloom, which Liberator cannot do, is you can sacrifice Canker Bloom even if you don't have an artifact or enchantment to target because of the third option, Proliferate. And the reason that is so good in Pioneer is because of the ubiquity of Bone Crusher Giant. So Bone Crusher Giant, if you can sacrifice this in response to a Bone Crusher Giant, then your opponent doesn't get to play the actual, or response to a Stomp, I should say. Your opponent doesn't get to play the Bone Crusher Giant. So just, very subtle thing that is not going to make a huge splash, but a very nice upgrade, in my opinion, to the Outland Liberators. Honorable mention numero trace, we have Vat of Rebirth. So there's a lot of text in this card. 1 mana artifact, so already looking pretty good. Whenever another artifact or creature you control is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, put an oil counter on Vat of Rebirth. Notably, it counts artifact or creatures. 2 and a black, tap, remove 4 oil counters from Vat of Rebirth, return a creature from your graveyard to the battlefield. Activate only as a sorcery. So there's a couple of very notable things on this text box. The first one is you don't sacrifice it when you use it, which is something that a lot of cards like this may have had in the past. So you just get to keep re-upping it, essentially. And the other thing is return the creature from your graveyard to the battlefield, not your hand, which is, maybe something you would have seen on other cards in the past. This is very, very nice with... So I wanted to put this in my top 10. Because I think I have a couple of ideas for decks in minds with this in Pioneer alongside with Witch's Oven and Cauldron Familiar, because when you have Oven and Familiar, you go tap, sacrifice the Familiar, 1 oil counter, then you sacrifice the food to bring back the Familiar, that's a second oil counter. That's half of the activation in just 1 Cat Oven loop. So if you have 2 ovens, you can just get you can get 4 counters in this thing very easily. Also potentially in Modern with Asmo, because you can go like Cookbook, play Asmo, get second Cookbook, use Cookbook to make food. That's 2 food, which triggers the VAT, and then you have the 2 Cookbooks to go again for next turn, and then that's an immediate activation. So now in Modern, it's a little easier to find discard outlets because you have Cookbook, potentially Seasoned Pyromancer. In Pioneer, I'm not quite sure how I want to build this deck yet. So the options are Fable of the Mirror Breaker, powerful. The what's the 2/1 Scrapwork Mutt, potentially Rafine's Informant, stuff like that. Voldaren Epicure, Bloodscythe Harvester. So those are the discard outlets that you can utilize for Vat of Rebirth. Also noticeably with the blood tokens, specifically with Bloodscythe Harvester and Voldaren Epicure, the blood token triggers the Vat of Rebirth, so you get an oil counter, which digs you closer to your Cat Oven. Now I think the best payoffs that I can think of in Pioneer are probably going to be Ashen Rider and Titan of Industry. Potentially, there could be like Agent of Treachery, maybe even what's the new Atraxa. So we could maybe do something like that. I'm sure I'll work on this card. There's a lot of text, and I'm a super big fan of it, but it's another honorable mention. We have officially made it into the top 10, and we are going to start with Bloated Contaminator. 2 in green, 4/4 trample, toxic 1. Whenever it deals combat damage to a player, proliferate. So pretty simple text box. The biggest home that I see for this card, and a deck that I have a very, very soft spot for, near and dear to my heart, that I've worked on a ton, is Hardened Scales in Pioneer. I have a couple of different lists in mind with this, but the play pattern that I can envision is, play this on turn 2 off of a Llanowar Elf, and then your follow-up is, say, maybe you go Hardened Scales into... say you go like Scales into something that puts a counter on the Contaminator, make it a 6/6, hit them, make it an 8/8. Now, the Toxic is not really ever going to come up, I would assume, that much, but just the body on this thing is really nice. 3 mana for a 4/4. People play Fatal Push in Pioneer, but it's not the easiest to turn on. You don't have fetch lands, so, Revolt is not a free roll like it is in Modern, and it doesn't die to Bone Crusher Giant, doesn't die to Strangle, Fiery Impulse. So the body's nice. It has trample, so you can't chump block it. And if you can, get some other counter synergies like Luminarch Aspirant, Nissa Voice, Vizendikar, Quirion Beastcaller. There's a couple other cards that I was having in mind. Oh, the 1-drops too. Experiment 1 Pelt Collector. I have some Scales decks, and we're definitely going to show those in the channel because I think this card's pretty sweet. So that is number 10. Number 9, the mommy herself, Elesh Norn, Mother of Machines. If you've if you have a Twitter account, you've probably already seen what this card does, because there's been, numerous discussions on this card in the Commander format, which we're not going to discuss it within the Commander format because that's not my cup of tea. But what this is 5 mana for a 4/7 Vigilance. If a permanent entering the battlefield causes a triggered ability of a permanent you control to trigger, that ability triggers an additional time. And then, permanents entering the battlefield don't cause abilities of permanents your opponents control to trigger. Now, this might seem a little, getting it into the top 10. I really only see one home for this card, and that's in the Enigmatic Incarnation deck in Pioneer, which is a deck that I've been playing a ton of. I absolutely love that deck, and I think it is going to be crazy in that deck. But I really don't see a ton of other homes, but the reason it is in my top 10 was because of that. The Incarnation deck has, a ton of 4-mana enchantments between Incarnation and, extra Fires of Inventions that you want to sacrifice to get to Elesh Norn. You get to double up triggers on Leyline Binding, double up triggers on literally any permanent. So Chain of the Rocks, Bitter Reunion, just any of those enchantments that that enter the battlefield. It's also, you can do some pretty disgusting things with Yorion. You get like a double Yorion trigger, which it just gets out of control. Double Agent of Treachery, double Titan of Industry, and then stopping your opponent's triggers is actually really good in Pioneer. So there's Isika's Chariot, a big one. The mono green deck has Cavalier of Thorns, Old Growth Troll, which gets triggered off of Kiora. So plenty of things that don't, that it shuts off. I'm sure there's plenty of other things, but yeah, I think this is going to be a very easy fill-in into that Incarnation deck, and that is why it is number 9 on my list. Number 8 here, we have Atraxa Grand Unifier. This is a card that I haven't really seen a ton of people talking about, but I actually think it's going to be quite potent in a couple of spots. So let's read off. It's got a lot of text on it, but it's green, white, blue, black, and 3 colorless for a 7/7 Flying Vigilance Death Touch lifelink. When it enters the battlefield, reveal the top 10 cards of your library. For each card type, you may put a card of that type from among the revealed cards into your hand, put the rest in the bottom. I think this caused a lot of buzz because it mentions a new card type battle, which we did not see in Phyrexia All Will Be One. So, still kind of up in the air, whatever the heck that is. But there's a couple of spots that I really like this in. So the aforementioned Enigmatic Incarnation deck does have Leyline Binding to get the 7-drop. Can you imagine a situation where you Incarnation, sack a 4 to get Elesh Norn, and then the next turn you sack Binding to get Atraxa, and you get 2 Atraxa triggers? You're just going to draw 10 cards or whatever, which might be too many cards. But the other spot that I really like this in is actually, and I was brewing this deck before I made this video, and that's actually why it ended up being a little bit higher on my list than it was. I was going to make it an honorable mention, but I don't want to spoil it too much. But there's Neoform in Pioneer, and people have been trying Neoform with like mill enablers like Tygom Scheming, Contingency Plan, Otherworldly Gaze, and then you put either Tassiger or Hooting Bandrels into play, Neoform that into a 7-drop. They usually use Velomachus, and they would take a bunch of turns. But I have an idea where you can play like a fair in quotes, Neoform deck with this, and you basically just use it as this giant threat that's hard to kill. It's also an Angel, which means it doesn't die to Power Word Kill, which is a common removal spell that Rakdos plays. And it just gets you a ton of value. And the nice thing is Atraxa will likely find you a Neoform and another creature. So even if your Atraxa dies, you just go again. So I think this card is going to be pretty good, and I'm pretty excited to try it out specifically in that Neoform deck, and that's why it is number 8. Here we go with number 7, Sword of Forge and Frontier. This is the second to last sword. We don't actually have the blue-black one, which is unfortunately not in the set. I would not be surprised if it was in the next set. Or something along those lines. But in any case, what we have here is 3 mana for an equipment. Equip 2. Equip creature has +2/+2, pro red and green. Whenever equipped creature deals combat damage to a player, exile the top 2 cards of your library. You can play those cards this turn. You can play an additional land this turn as well. Now, the text box on this is not the best. So it effectively will, most of the time, will draw you at least a card. The turn that you equip it, you're investing 2 mana into it, so you're not likely to be able to, like, if you hit 2 spells off of it, you're probably not going to be able to play both spells, maybe get one.
But the additional land is nice because the turn, even if you like, let's say you tap out for the sword, like you play your land, you equip your creature, you attack with the sword, and you're all tapped out. As long as you hit a land off of that, you still get some value out of it. That is nice. You do get some card advantage that way. The reason I have this card high and in my top 10 is not so much for modern. I don't really think it's gonna get played in modern that much, but in Pioneer specifically, when swords were around the second time, not the very first time, but the second time, it was in a standard with that had a lot of one mana elves, and one of the better strategies in that format was just elves plus swords. And a lot of the best decks, well, some of the best decks in Pioneer have 4 Llanowar Elf, 4 Elvish Mystic, and I think this card is just a slam dunk. I'm in those decks. I think I'm probably going to start with 2 to 3 copies in the Gruul Boats deck, and there's maybe some other Llanowar Elves decks that might want to play this card. So the trigger, the hit trigger is not the best, but just the fact that you get to play a sword that has any amount of relevant text is awesome, and that's why it is number 7 on the list. Number 6 here, this is kind of a personal favorite of mine, Cacophony Scamp. So this is 1/1 for a red. Whenever it's a Phyrexian Goblin Warrior, which those are 3 somewhat relevant creature types. One of them is probably more relevant than the others. Whenever it deals combat damage to a player, you may sacrifice it. If you do, proliferate. When it dies, it deals damage equal to its power to any target. So there has been there's been a Pioneer Colossus Hammer deck in the past that people have tried a couple of times, but it feels like it's always been missing a piece or two. And Cacophony Scamp, along with potentially another card on this list, I think really gives the Pioneer Hammer deck the tools that it may need to actually be very good. So imagine this scenario. Just bear with me for a moment. Turn 1, you play Cacophony Scamp. Your opponent maybe plays a Triumph or a tap Shockland. On your turn 2, you play pre-combat, you play your second land, a Sigardus Aid, you attack with your Cacophony Scamp, and then you put a Colossus Hammer on it. So your opponent takes 11 damage because Hammer gives it +10/+10, and then your Cacophony Scamp triggers, which allows you to sacrifice it to proliferate. There's nothing to proliferate, but who cares? Because then when it dies, it deals damage equal to its power, which is 11 to your opponent. And that means your opponent took 22 damage on turn 2, and they hadn't even played a spell. So I think this card is potentially going to make Hammer a viable strategy in Pioneer, and the one creature type that matters in this card is Warrior. There's a card called Resolute Strike that pays you off for having Warriors. And now we actually have Cacophony Scamp and Fireblade Charger. Fireblade Charger is essentially a worse Cacophony Scamp because it can't sacrifice itself, but it has the same text. When it dies, it deals damage equal to its power to any target, and it's also a Warrior. So you have 8 1-drop Warriors that, when they die, you just dome shot your opponent, and you have the Resolute Strike along with the hammers, the Sigardus Aids. There's some other stuff. I got some ideas cooking. But yeah, I think this card is going to make Pioneer Hammer a very viable strategy, and that's why it's number 6. All right, and coming in at number 5, we have the Mycosynth Gardens. This is a land sphere. Sure doesn't look like a sphere to me. The first couple lines of text don't matter too much. I mean, it does tap for colorless, but X tap, Mycosynth Gardens becomes a copy of target non-token artifact you control with mana value X. Now, this is our first... I don't think it's going to see play outside of Modern, but this is a card for Amulet of Vigor. And the reason it's so high on my list, even though I think it realistically only has one application, I think it is very, very powerful in that deck. I would like to say I am no Amulet expert by any means, but I have heard some Amulet aficionados on Twitter say that they think this card is going to be a slam dunk 4 of in that deck, so I'll take their word for it. I'm sure it's going to, give you some redundancy with your amulets. If you draw, say, Saga and Gardens, you now have drawn 2 amulets, because you can go Chapter 3, Saga get amulet, Gardens copy amulet, play bounce land, go from there. So, not a ton to talk about with this one, but it is pretty high, because this would be my bet for a card in the set that actually sees the most amount of play, just relative to how many copies of it, because I'm assuming you're going to play forward amulet. So that would be my pick for a card that's going to see the most play in Modern, and that's why it's number 5. I'm cheating a little bit here for number 4, but this is Razorverge Thicket, and you might notice this doesn't have a Phyrexia Owl Be 1 set symbol on it. That's because it's a reprint. And all of the fast lands, Razor Verge Thicket, Dark Slick Shores, I'm forgetting the names, Blackcleave Cliffs, Seachrome Coast, Copperline Gorge. Those are the 5. Yeah, I knew that. Those have all been reprinted into Pioneer. Now, Razor Verge Thicket is, I think, the most important one because specifically the green one. So Thicket and Gorge, I think, are the most important because decks that are playing like 2 and 3 color Llanowar Elf decks tend to have other 1-drops that are in the other color or 2 if this, if they're playing 3 colors. And that's why the fast lands are so important at allowing you to cast your Llanowar Elves and still be able to, cast your other 1-drops. Maybe you have some 3-drops that like Skyclave Apparition is a good example. The way that the mana currently is in Pioneer, it's nearly impossible to go turn 1 Llanowar Elf, turn 2 Skyclave, or turn 1 Elf, turn 2 Spellqueller. So potentially see an uptick in like Bant Company style decks that want to do that kind of thing. The other application is Boggles. Razor Verge Thicket's a massive upgrade because they're trying to cast Gladecover Scout. They have white, I think they have white 1-drops, other green 1-drops, but then they're trying to cast like multiple white auras on turn 2, which is just not feasible without Thicket. So, a minor thing, but it's so high because it's so important to a lot of different decks, and that's why the fast lands, number 4. And we get to number 3, Capricious Hellraiser. So this is kind of a fun one. So this is one that Aspiring Spike has been talking a lot about. It's 3 triple red for a 4/4 flyer. This spell costs 3 less to cast if you have 9 or more cards in your graveyard, so it would cost 3 red. When it enters the battlefield, exile 3 cards at random from your graveyard. Choose a non-creature, non-land card from among them and copy it. You may cast the copy without paying its mana cost. So, I think this is the card that Aspiring Spike has said he thinks this will probably be his pick for the best modern card in the set, and maybe that ends up being the case over something like a Mycosynth Gardens. Maybe it ends up being a little bit better. It's way more fun, that's 100% sure. But modern, it's a lot easier to enable just getting 9 cards. And the nice thing about this card, it just says 9 cards, not like, it doesn't specify spells or instant sorceries like, Bedlam Reveler has in the past. This is just any cards. Just if you got 9 cards in your graveyard, boom, 3-mana 4/4. So in modern, it's a lot easier to turn on with like fetch lands, Mishra's Baubles, Dragon's Rage Channeler triggers. The applications that I see in Pioneer, and I made this tweet a week ago at this point. This card with Breaking and Entering in Pioneer. So Breaking and Entering is blue-black. It's a split card, but the card that we care about is, I think it's Breaking. Blue-black for a sorcery. Target player mills 8 cards. So there you go. That's 9 right there because the Breaking Entering is the 9th card. Now, I will say it's kind of ambitious to cast a blue-black sorcery on turn 2 and a triple red card on turn 3, especially given the mana base in Pioneer with no fetch lands. But, as long as you can distribute your dual lands accordingly and play a bunch of red duels, which we can now do because we have Blackcleave Cliffs, I could see it. There's maybe something there. And I'll probably try this, those 2 combination of cards in Pioneer to maybe some middling success. But and the nice thing about it is in Pioneer you actually get to play some more graveyard payoffs, like you have Treasure Cruise. So you're Breaking and Entering, even if you don't draw Hellraiser, can just enable your 1-mana cruise. And the cruise can also, like, you can set up some cool things where you go Hellraiser, like on turn 4, for example. You go, I guess you can't really do that. You'd have to do it with Dig Through Time. But what you can do is, say you have Dig Through Time, and this is Magical Christmas Land, I know. You can go cast your Hellraiser, trigger on the stack, Dig Through Time to delve your graveyard away, and only leave, like, busted spells for the Hellraiser. Maybe you're more likely to do that with a card like Murderous Cut, where, again, turn 4, Hellraiser, trigger on the stack, Murderous Cut, delve some, cards that you don't want away, so you're more likely to hit the busted card. And you could also maybe play, you could mill over Temporal Trespass, you could discard it with, mill it over with Consider, discard it with other stuff. There's some things that you can cook with there, and that's why I think this card is super fun. It's going to be a lot of fun to play with, and that's why it's number 3 on the list. All right, number 2, we alluded to this earlier. This is Skrelv Defector Might. So this is 1 white for a 1/1 legendary artifact creature, Phyrexian Might, Toxic 1, can't block. You can pay a Phyrexian white, tap it, choose a color. Another target creature you control gains Toxic 1 and hexproof from that color until end of turn. It can't be blocked by creatures of that color this turn. This card might be a little bit too high on my list, and I'm willing to admit that. where I see this card being at its best. So I think Hammer Time could potentially want to play this card. I'm not sure it's going to replace Giver of Runes entirely because it is legendary and it has 1 toughness, which is a really big downside against stuff like Ren and 6. But the upside is that it's an artifact, so it turns on, it helps enable your Metalcraft for Paladin, makes your constructs bigger, stuff like that. Notably, you cannot search this with Urza Saga, so just remember that. The other place that I think this card's going to be quite good is that hammer deck that we mentioned. Excuse me, the hammer deck that we mentioned earlier in Pioneer, which was always just missing 1 or 2 cards. I think this card is going to be potentially really good in that deck. Couple of reasons. One, it is legend. Well, I guess the biggest reason is that it's legendary. So the hammer deck now gets to play Skrelv, which is legendary 1-drop. Kemba, a card we haven't talked about, but it's a legend that you might want to play in Hammer. I think I want to potentially play Jorkadine, which is another card from the new set we didn't get to discuss. But all of these legends, these 1 and 2 mana legends, enable Mox Amber. Mox Amber then allows you to cast a card like Astor, Bearer of Blades, which is potentially powerful with Colossus Hammer, but it was a card that you couldn't really play before because you didn't have the legendary support for Mox Amber, and it's really hard to just play a 4-drop in your Colossus Hammer deck. Now, if you can play it a turn ahead of schedule, it's maybe more reasonable. So I got some ideas cooking with Colossus Hammer and Pioneer, and we'll get to that once the new set is fully available online. But I think this card's potentially pretty good, and it protects you when you're going for a hammer. If you play this on turn 1 and then you maybe go for a hammer, a turn or 2 later down the road, you can protect your creature from a fatal push. You can also make it so your opponent can't block your creature. So if you have a Scamp and they have a chump blocker, you can maybe just go give your creature protection from green, attack, hammer, hit them, just kill them. So, yeah, I think this card has some applications. Again, it might be a little too high. Maybe I should have it a little bit lower. Let me know what you think in the comments, but that is my number 2. And if you've been watching my Twitch channel on, over the past couple of weeks, you probably have an idea of what number 1 is, but let's just throw it on the screen for you. To the surprise of a lot of people, or to the surprise of not a lot of people here, I should say, Tivar, Jubilant Brawler is my number 1 card in the set. When I first saw this card, I just, I'm not going to say it's completely broken. It's not a broken card, but I was very, very surprised at all of the abilities that they put on this card for the mana cost as well. So black, green, and a colorless for 3 loyal, enters the battlefield with 3 loyalty. Static ability, you may activate abilities of creatures you control as though those creatures had haste. This includes mana abilities. We'll get to that in a second. +1, untap up to 1 target creature. -2, mill 3 cards, then you may return a creature card with mana value 2 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. So, couple of things going on with this card. First and foremost, you may activate abilities of creatures as though they had haste. This is very powerful with cards that generate multiple mana, because you essentially are paying less mana for the card. It effectively, like, let's say, you play a Tivar and then you play a Llanowar Elf. That's a free spell, because then you can tap the elf immediately. Or when you get into stuff that is taps for more mana, Gwenna, tap, effectively you're paying 1 mana for your Gwenna. If you're a little bit lower on lands, you can just go play Gwenna, tap it for 2, and maybe you have an Acerak. Well, that's a foreshadowing, but that is what I think this card is going to be good in. It's going to really help the Acerak combo deck in Pioneer, because you have, again, giving Gwenna haste, making it so it can tap the turn that it comes into play. It also untaps Gwenna, so you can go tap Gwenna for 2, untap it with Tivar, be able to play more creatures that turn. Then that's just an immediate mana for Acerak right there. The other thing that it's really nice with is Fauna Shaman. Now, Fauna Shaman is a card that was recently reprinted, hasn't seen a ton of play. But imagine for a second if your Fauna Shaman had haste, and if you could activate Fauna Shaman twice in the same turn, which this card allows you to do by itself. So you can imagine a scenario where you go turn 3, or turn 2 Tivar, I guess, off of a Llanowar Elf, and then you go land number 4, or mana source number 4, play Fauna Shaman, immediately activate it, search for a combo piece, and then Tivar can untap it, and then you can search for another combo piece. So makes Fauna Shaman really powerful. So that is kind of like the Acerak combo deck, where, Acerak, Gwenna, Kinnan, which I think is still bugged on Magic Online. We'll have to do some testing and figure that out, which is unfortunate. Really hope they would fix that, But the other place that I really like Tivar is Elves, which is a deck that, another deck that's near and dear to my heart. Pioneer Elves, I've been working on it for a little bit. So Tivar is very powerful, specifically with Circle of Dreams Druid. Because Circle of Dreams Druid, like, you can imagine a scenario where you go turn 1 Llanowar Elf, turn 2 Tivar. And I keep saying Llanowar Elf, but yes, you're obviously, if you're casting Tivar on turn 2, it's way better. And then the turn after, you play, like, again, remember, your Llanowar Elves are effectively free because they come into play and you can immediately tap them for mana. So whatever Llanowar Elves in your hand are left over in your hand, you just put them all into the battlefield. And then Circle is powerful when you have a ton of other creatures. So if you're, basically just putting all these elves into play for free, then you play Circle. Maybe you tap Circle for 4 mana, 3 or 4 mana. You then untap the Circle with Tivar. So basically, you've effectively just generated a free Gaia's, well, not free, but a Gaia's Cradle that you can now untap with Tivar, and it has haste. So you go Circle, make 4, Tivar, untap it, make 4 more, and then that mana you can just use to cast, say, a Coco, or maybe you can cast a Leafcrown Visionary and then some other spells to keep churning through. And then Leafcrown Visionary can find you another Circle, which you can then play because you have mana left over, and then it also has haste. So you can like, if you can chain enough stuff with Leafcrown Druid, you can just kind of draw, however many cards as long as you have enough creatures and leftover mana available. But yeah, this card I think is going to be super powerful in the Elves deck. Those are the 2 homes that I'm the most excited for. I think it could potentially see play in Modern in like a Devoted Druid deck, because giving Devoted Druid haste is really nice, and then the -2 being able to get back Devoted Druid is pretty nice. That's one thing that I don't think is going to be as powerful in Pioneer, because I think most of the stuff that you're doing with Tivar and Pioneer is going to be with 3-drops, like we talked about Gwenna, Acererak, Circle of Dreams Druid. It does get back Fauna Shaman, which is kind of cool. So if you like play a Shaman and they push it, you can Tivar, get back Shaman, activate it immediately, which is pretty sick. So you just a ton of different things to do with this card. By far and away my favorite card in the set, and one that I'm going to be playing a lot with over the next couple of weeks. So that was our top 10 and some honorable mentions for Phyrexia. All will be 1. I would be ecstatic to hear what is your favorite card in the set, Modern or Pioneer. Just give me your thoughts on the set overall as a whole. Would love to hear what you think, and hope you all enjoyed the video, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Peace.